At Christmas dinner, my father said, "You are not even family." The line was drawn, but the foundation for that stand had been built slowly, brick by brick, starting years earlier, Boda with the first desperate text message I received in college. I was 21, juggling classes with two-part-time jobs and living in a cramped apartment where the heat barely worked. Every dollar was stretched until it screamed, Boda, all under the false assumption that life would eventually open up for me once I graduated. Nothing prepared me for the fact that the first small transfer I made, barely enough to cover an overdue phone bill for my mother, would become the marker for the next decade of my life. Boda. I convinced myself it was a one-off act of necessity, a temporary fix for a family simply going through a rough patch. That was the narrative I used to justify it to myself. I sent the money, felt a small, fleeting warmth of being needed, and then immediately went back to worrying about my own tuition. After graduation, Boda, I finally moved to Charlotte for my first corporate role as an analyst. It wasn't glamorous, but the salary was stable, allowing me, for the first time, to picture a future that wasn't built entirely on worry. I rented a small studio apartment, decorated it cheaply, and savored the feeling of control. I felt grown up, capable, and financially autonomous. That feeling lasted about 3 months. The messages from home began arriving with quiet urgency, always asking for just a little help until next month. It was never a big disaster at first, just slow, insistent erosion. A balance that needed immediate attention, a fee that had doubled overnight, a situation that no one else could handle right now. They didn't come wrapped in shame. They came wrapped in the suggestion that I was the stable one, the smart one, the one who understood how money worked, the only one who could save them. I desperately wanted to believe that stepping in was kindness, that helping them meant moving forward together as a unit. I wanted my competence to be appreciated. But the requests never slowed. Instead, they changed shape and grew larger. An overdue utility bill would be followed by a repair for my brother Brian's unreliable car. A missed payment for a loan I had never agreed to would show up with an apology that dissolved the moment the money was sent. Every time I told myself, this is the last time, something new and unpredictable would erupt. A health crisis, an eviction notice, Boda. An emergency repair, something only Victor, the corporate analyst, could patch before it collapsed entirely. My stability was their emergency fund, one they never had to replenish. This became the core dynamic of my 20s. I was chasing promotions and taking on extra work, not for myself, but to keep the safety net strong. Boda. I didn't see myself as a resentful victim. I saw myself as the responsible adult in a group that simply couldn't manage. I learned to live smaller so they could live without facing consequences. I held off on replacing worn out clothes, skipped upgrades, and limited my own life so theirs could keep running at an unsustainable pace. I clung fiercely to the idea that this financial investment meant belonging. I believed that if I kept solving their problems, eventually they would look at me and finally say, "Thank you, Victor. We are so lucky to have you. Huh. You belong." What I didn't see then was how deeply this imbalance had carved itself into my identity. The problems at home never resolved. They simply reset and returned, and I became the shadow financier who no one acknowledged, but everyone depended upon. The more I sacrificed, Boda, the more invisible I felt. The success I built in Charlotte was not a shield. It was just a bigger magnet for the family's unending crisis. Boda. I was moving forward, but I was constantly being pulled back by a financial undertow I couldn't escape. That tightening in my chest, whenever my phone buzzed with an Atlanta number, was a constant reminder that stability was something I provided for everyone but myself. Boda. The pattern was set, relentless, and draining, and it would soon consume the only real prospect I had for a life outside of their debt. Boda. With my checking account constantly cycling between stability and near zero, and the constant tension emanating from Atlanta, I met Sarah. She was the one part of my life that felt real and stable, a temporary reprieve. Sarah Hayes was a graphic designer, patient and empathetic, Boda, with an easy laugh that could momentarily mute the constant background hum of my financial worries. She loved to build things, a brand identity, a future, Boda, a relationship, and she approached commitment with the same quiet confidence I desperately lacked. When she entered my life, Boda, I genuinely believed I could balance the two worlds, the chaotic, demanding family, and the steady, hopeful future she offered. Uh, Sarah wanted to build something real. She spoke of weekend trips, saving for a down payment, and simple, quiet evenings together. She represented a future that wasn't defined by urgent debt and late fees. I wanted that future more than anything, but the family's crisis always found a way to invade. We have to cancel the hiking trip, I told her one Friday, pulling my phone away from my ear. It's the power bill, they're shutting it off tomorrow, and they need the money wired tonight. Sarah didn't yell. She never did. She just sat on the edge of my couch, holding the tickets for the state park we weren't going to see. Victor, that's the second time this month. I understand the severity, but you can't keep sacrificing everything we plan for things that are not your responsibility. But if I don't, Mom and Dad will be in the dark. I countered, the ingrained sense of duty making my voice sharp. I can't let that happen. I'm the only one who can fix it. You are the only one who lets them stay broken, she said gently, but the words cut deeper than any shouting. They are adults, Victor. And every time you step in, you postpone the consequence they need to face. The requests grew, and the excuses became thinner and more rehearsed. A weekend getaway was postponed because I felt guilty spending money on myself when I knew my brother Brian was complaining about a missed car payment. Nights out were canceled because I was mentally calculating how to cover a shortfall before the end of the month. My focus was split, my energy depleted, and Sarah saw it all. She saw the exhaustion in my eyes that I couldn't hide, that my brother. And she felt the constant strain that came from trying to tether myself to her life while simultaneously acting as the financial anchor for a collapsing family system. She stayed longer than most would have, fueled by her patience and her genuine love for the person I was when I wasn't distracted. But even she reached her limit. The constant stream of emergencies, the financial black hole, and my refusal to establish boundaries eventually wore her down. She realized she wasn't dating a partner. She was dating a perpetual first responder. When she finally walked away, the devastation was immediate, but the emotion in the room wasn't anger. It was a profound, wary sadness. I can't build a life with you, Victor, she explained, her voice low and steady as she packed her last box. Because you are already living someone else's. Boda. I am tired of planning around crises that are not ours. I need a partner who is present, not constantly looking over his shoulder at Atlanta. I understood that kind of exhaustion far too well. It was the same exhaustion I carried every day. Her departure was devastating because it confirmed my deepest fear. My attempts to earn acceptance from my family were actively destroying my chances at an independent life. After Sarah left, I threw myself entirely into work. I earned more promotions, took on more responsibilities, and pushed myself harder, Boda, convincing myself that if I just made enough money, I could solve both problems. I could shield myself with success, and I could maintain the safety net without feeling the pinch. But the more I made, the faster the money evaporated. Sarah's empty side of the bed was a constant, Boda, tangible reminder that the cost of carrying my family was not just financial, it was the entire future I had wanted. Boda. Her absence solidified the profound loss and loneliness that would carry me through the next few months until I reached the final breaking point at the Christmas dinner table. After Sarah left, I threw myself entirely into work, Boda, achieving those promotions and taking on more responsibilities. I convinced myself that this higher income would finally be the shield I needed, but it was a lie. The more money I made, and the faster the problems at home materialized to meet that new ceiling. I was just a bigger sponge for the same relentless, recurring crisis. The drive from Charlotte to Atlanta for the Christmas holiday felt longer and heavier than usual. It wasn't the traffic, Boda. It was the psychological weight of anticipating the familiar tension that always settled over these gatherings. I gripped the steering wheel, watching the low, gray sky blur past the window. The closer I got to the city limits, the more my chest tightened with a profound sense of inevitability. I tried to rationalize the trip. Showing up for the holiday was the right thing to do. Being present mattered, I insisted, even when the past felt suffocatingly heavy. Boda. It was the familiar self-deception I had repeated for years, the mantra that had carried me through a decade of financial sacrifice. Boda. This internal debate carried me through the last few miles until the signs pointed toward the quiet, slightly run-down neighborhood where my family lived. Their rental house sat on a street lined with aging ranch-style homes. Nothing had changed much over the years. The paint was still chipped around the windows, the front steps were still uneven, Boda, and the flickering porch light cast a pale, weak glow in the early dusk. It was not a place that felt warm or inviting, Boda, but it was where they were, and that had always been the only reason I needed to show up. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a long moment after shutting off the engine, listening only to the cooling tick of the metal. I knew stepping inside meant stepping back into the pressurized atmosphere of unspoken needs and unacknowledged debts. Still, I forced myself to get out and walk to the front door, forcing my breathing to remain even and steady. Inside, the house smelled faintly of spices and old, dusty carpet. My mother greeted me with a quick hug, a perfunctory gesture that felt more like a routine check than a display of affection. My father, George, merely nodded from across the room without taking a step closer. Neither reaction surprised me. Boda. I had long ago realized I wasn't the one whose arrival changed the energy of the room. My presence was merely anticipated, not celebrated. I moved to the living room, taking in the scene. My brother Brian was louder than ever, confident, moving with the ease of someone who knew he was the central figure. His wife, Hannah, offered me a soft smile. A gentle, Boda, careful gesture that seemed to acknowledge the imbalance that everyone else willfully ignored. I took my usual seat at the dinner table, the one that never seemed to shift, no matter how many years passed. I had learned that observing was simpler and safer. It kept me from disrupting whatever fragile equilibrium they wanted to maintain. I was there, present in the house, but I felt myself settling into my usual role, the man who occupied a quieter, useful orbit. I was only needed when something needed fixing, Boda. And in moments like this, surrounded by noise that didn't include me, the truth of that role sharpened in ways that were hard to ignore. Even so, I stayed seated, telling myself that showing up mattered, clinging to familiar, painful that came with conditional belonging. I was prepared for the tension, but I was not prepared for the final, cold dismissal that was about to erupt. Dinner began with the strained politeness that always settled over these family gatherings, a fragile facade of normalcy. Forks clicked softly against the plates, and everyone slipped into the familiar, unspoken choreography of pretending things were fine. The table was crowded, yet it felt hollow, as if every gesture came from habit rather than genuine warmth. I watched my father, George, keep his gaze fixed on his plate, engaged yet detached, and my mother flutter between seats, attempting to smooth over invisible wrinkles in the night. There was nothing outwardly hostile, just a quiet, Boda, persistent imbalance that had existed for as long as I could remember. Across the table, Boda, my brother Brian Carter, took effortless control of the conversation. He had a natural talent for filling every vacant space, Boda, stretching small accomplishments into stories that drew easy laughs. People naturally leaned toward him, responding as if the room itself revolved around his orbit. He was talking about a minor update at his job, followed by weekend plans that involved a new expensive purchase he almost certainly couldn't afford. Hannah, his wife, sat beside him, smiling politely, her hands folded in her lap. Her presence was gentle and steady, but it did nothing to shift the focus, which always returned to Brian. When the conversation finally shifted my way, asking about my work as an analyst in Charlotte, the interest evaporated almost instantly. I offered a brief summary of a recent project. I was met with a quick nod here, a brief, muffled hum of acknowledgement there, and then the conversation immediately pivoted back to Brian's territory as if my contribution had been a necessary but boring commercial break. I had learned not to expect more than that. Recognition, I knew, was never mine to claim. My mother added comments here and there, sliding subtle comparisons into the discussion. Little, seemingly casual remarks about the importance of being stable, the necessity of responsibility, and the value of thinking about the future. None of them were directed at me explicitly, yet every single one found its mark. She didn't need to raise her voice or look directly at me. The implication always landed, reinforcing my role as the prudent, distant provider. George, my father, remained physically quiet, but his silence carried a palpable weight. Boda. It was the kind of quiet that waited for the smallest spark, ready to ignite. I felt it at the edge of every exchange, a tightening that warned me not to misstep, not to challenge the established narrative. He ate slowly and deliberately, never fully engaging in the superficial chatter, bought it, yet ready to shift the entire tone of the evening with a single sentence if something displeased him. Boda. As the plates emptied and the casual chatter of the others grew louder, I could sense the temperature of the room subtly changing. The warmth from the food didn't reach me. Instead, a faint pressure was building, subtle but unmistakable. It gathered in the spaces between comments, in the fleeting looks exchanged across the table, and in the way my siblings carefully avoided meeting my eyes for too long. Something unspoken was knitting itself together, a network of tension where each thread tugged at the next. I stayed mostly quiet, not out of fear, but out of simple, profound exhaustion. It took energy to sit at a table where belonging had always felt conditional. I watched hands move, shoulders shift, and smiles stretch across faces that had never turned toward me with the same easy affection they showed each other. Being in the room, but never truly a part of it, was a familiar ache that settled deeper as the minutes passed. At one point, my sister-in-law, Hannah Saboda, leaned back in her chair, folding her arms, as if bracing for something she knew was coming. Bada. Her posture mirrored the quiet dread that was threading its way through the evening. The clatter of cutlery slowly faded as people finished eating, and the noise level dropped significantly, Boda, leaving more room for the heaviness that had been growing beneath the surface. Conversations became shorter, less natural, slipping into pauses that stretched just a little too long. A stillness settled over us, thin but volatile, like air waiting for the strike of a match. The stillness that had settled over the dining room was thin but volatile, like air waiting for a spark. Everyone felt it. The low hum of unresolved tension that signaled the night had reached its breaking point. Then my father, George, set his glass down with a force that was not loud, but sharp enough to slice through every remaining whisper. Heads turned instinctively, acknowledging that the control of the evening had shifted entirely to him. George leaned forward in his chair, Boda, planting his elbows on the table, his eyes fixed on something only he could see, perhaps a reflection of his own entitlement. The room felt suspended between breaths. We waited, not actively, but instinctively, Boda, sensing that none of us had permission to interrupt the shift that was about to occur. I felt it, too, an uneasy pull that tightened the air around my ribs. He started with a comment that didn't sound sharp at first. It was a small criticism, a veiled remark about our attitude during a past family crisis, wrapped in the kind of tone he used to remind me of my place without saying it outright. I held still, absorbing each word with the practiced calm I had developed over a decade. Then another remark followed, sharper this time. He spoke of my contribution, my priorities, and a failure to be present when he needed me. The specifics blurred almost immediately, because it wasn't the words themselves that landed, but the force behind them. They came out quick, almost rehearsed, as if he had been storing them for months, waiting for the perfect holiday setting to weaponize them. I waited. I waited for my mother to intervene, for Brian to try and redirect the moment, for any sign that the discomfort wasn't mine alone, any indication that the family dynamic was about to soften or that someone would interrupt this attack. But no one moved. Brian Carter stared intensely at his hands. Hannah kept her gaze fixed downward. Even my mother, usually the eager soother of edges, remained utterly quiet. Their collective submission was the greatest betrayal of all. It affirmed his right to speak and my duty to absorb it. Finally, my father's voice dropped, steady and deliberate, carving a line straight through the center of the table. He looked me straight in the eye and delivered the ultimate dismissal. You are not even family. Everything around me dissolved into an icy stillness. The sound of breathing paused. His eyes didn't waver. He wasn't angry, just certain, coldly, confidently certain of the place he believed I belonged in, outside. In that slow, shattering moment, a fire started behind my sternum. It wasn't explosive rage, but a precise, controlled burn, gathering all the years of quiet sacrifice into a single point. I felt the weight of every transfer I had made, every crisis I had patched, every moment I had swallowed my own exhaustion so theirs could be eased. None of it appeared on his face. None of it mattered to him. I realized then that the equation had never included me in the way I thought it did. I had merely been a resource to be consumed. Across the table, my sister-in-law shifted in her seat, the movement barely noticeable. She didn't speak. She didn't defend me. Her silence was its own answer, confirming the isolation I had been avoiding for years. Brian let his shoulders fall slightly, not in regret, but in resignation, as though he had expected this outcome all along. Something inside me aligned with a terrible, liberating clarity. The years of sacrifice converged into a final point of undeniable betrayal. My father had played his last, cruel card, and in doing so, he had handed me the only true power I had ever held in this room. He had forced my hand. I was free to act, knowing that nothing I did could make them value me less than they already had. The terrible, silent weight of the room was now entirely focused on me. I knew what I had to do to reclaim my life. In that frozen moment, after my father's cruel declaration, I didn't feel rage. I felt a terrifying, liberating clarity about what I had to do. The financial sacrifice of a decade now felt like a debt I had been forced to pay for a service they were refusing to provide acceptance. I pushed my chair back slowly, the motion deliberate, the small sound echoing in the silence. It was a grounding movement, pulling me away from the emotional whirlpool and back into my own body. The entire room followed the motion. Though no one dared look at me fully, their attention was absolute. My father, George, remained seated, smug and unmoved, still confident in his dismissal. I stood, lifted my glass, and felt the internal trembling settle into something quiet and resolute. The words that rose in me weren't rehearsed lines of anger. They came from the steady, cold realization that I had spent years investing in a version of family that only existed when it financially benefited them. I met his stare across the table, finally setting the boundary that should have been drawn years before this holiday. In that case, I said, my voice calm, the lack of emotion surprising even me. I paused just long enough for the gravity of the shift to settle over the table. Then, I delivered the blow that cut deeper than any emotional wound. After paying over $63,000 to keep this household afloat, then do not ask me for a single dollar more. The sentence left my mouth without a tremor. It didn't plead. It didn't demand. It simply placed the cold, quantifiable truth where it belonged, directly countering his attempt to erase my contribution. The shock on my father's face was immediate. He turned pale, realizing in that moment that his cash cow was cutting him off. The room reacted not with noise, but with a deeper, crushing silence, one that pressed down on every surface, turning the stillness into something heavy and inescapable. I could see Brian finally lift his head, his eyes widening as the number sank in, and my mother's hand flying to her mouth. They were not reacting to the emotion, they were reacting to the finality of the financial boundary. My glass remained raised for another second, an intentional pause that solidified the irreversible decision before I set it down gently. No one spoke. No one reached out to me. No one tried to undo what had just been said because they couldn't. The moment held steady, solid, and absolute. It was the point where something long overdue finally broke free. I turned away from the table, toward the door, without a word. There was no urge to look back, no flicker of guilt to soften the exit. I simply walked away from the history of sacrifice I had just meticulously numbered and laid bare. The door clicked shut behind me, sealing the silence and the consequences inside and leaving me alone in the sudden, cold air outside, carrying the terrifying, yet profound weight of freedom. I had successfully separated myself, physically and financially, from the toxic dynamic, and the silence that followed was heavy with the knowledge that the battle was finally over. My hands were steady as I walked to my car, Sabota, and I drove away slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of a need to breathe between each turn. Sabota. When I reached my apartment in Charlotte later that night, I dropped my keys on the counter and stood in the middle of the living room, letting the unfamiliar stillness settle around me. My phone buzzed within minutes, then again and again. I knew the pattern too well. Shock first, then deflection, then desperate attempts to turn the responsibility back onto me. I left the phone face down. For the first time, the guilt didn't surface, the boundary remained solid. Over the next few days, the consequences that had always been cushioned by my intervention began to take shape. I knew, without checking, when the overdue balance on the household utilities reached the point of automatic disconnection. When my phone lit up with a string of missed calls, I let them ring. Not long after, Brian lost his car. He had fallen behind on payments many times, and I had always stepped in. This time, no one bridged the gap. The towing company took it, leaving him stranded. His messages were brief and frustrated. I didn't respond. News traveled in fragments. The family had to quickly move into a smaller rental closer to the edge of the city, a place with lower costs but fewer comforts. They were forced to rearrange routines, stretch paychecks, and handle unexpected fees without a fallback. The shift was not dramatic, but it was real. Their life adjusted around the absence of my support. None of this brought me relief or satisfaction. What I felt instead was space. It was empty, unfamiliar, and entirely necessary. De Sabota. The absence of their demands revealed how much of my identity had been tied to fixing and carrying, and I finally had room to recognize how depleted I had been. Evenings grew quieter. My thoughts untangled slowly, no longer crowded with calculations about who needed what and when. I went to work, came home, and realized how rare it had been to move through a day without someone else's crisis intruding. The separation wasn't clean or easy, but it was firm. And, for the first time in years, the consequences unfolding across state lines didn't belong to me. I started making choices based on what I wanted, rather than what would keep the peace. I took a workshop on financial boundaries, BODA, mostly out of curiosity, and discovered how much of my adult life had been shaped by a fear disguised as responsibility, BODA. The instructor talked about how people slip into roles they never agreed to and how familiar burdens can feel safer than saying no. Work became easier to manage. Without the mental drag of constant interruptions, I performed better and allowed myself to consider possibilities I had previously ignored. The extra income I earned now was deliberate, chosen, and rooted in respect for myself. I hung art on my walls, replaced a worn-out chair, and bought a plant I knew I had time to care for. Boda. My apartment slowly became a reflection of who I was outside of obligation. I learned that separation doesn't always arrive with a dramatic ending. Boda. Sometimes it forms quietly in the space that grows when you stop carrying what was never yours. I no longer waited for the apology that would never come. I no longer needed it to move forward. The sense of relief simply remained steady and grounding, reminding me that freedom can feel uncomfortable at first, but honest in the long run. I had spent so long trying to earn a place that had never been offered, and walking away felt like reclaiming a part of myself I didn't know I had lost. The greatest lesson came into focus slowly. Family isn't defined by blood or by the years you spend trying to hold things together. Boda. It's defined by the people who treat you with honesty and see your value without expecting your sacrifice to prove it. Choosing yourself isn't abandonment, it is survival.